Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 11th presentation of Avalanche Canada's webinar series. We're putting these on through this winter. My name is Brent Strand. I'll be your producer for the evening. We have Nancy Geismar and Jennifer George as the moderators on the chat box, and we're super stoked to have you folks out tonight. With COVID on the horizon here, it's meant that we're not delivering our face-to-face public outreach events for presentations and knowledge. But with this format, Avalanche Canada has been able to reach so many more people, it feels like. Our mission is to help educate backcountry users such as yourself so you can go out and play safe. We all want you to know more, go farther, and come home. First off, we really want to thank all our sponsors for their financial support during these challenging economic times and working with us to reach the new backcountry users out there this winter. There seems to be a whole lot of them out there. Everyone, you're muted automatically when you come into this session. There's going to be opportunities to ask questions. So to do so, you just hit the raise hand button there on your go-to panel, and we'll lean on you guys in the question area, and you can ask a verbal question. And as well, you can type something into the question chat box there. Feel free to ask those questions at any time throughout the sessions. Today's presentation being Backcountry Avy Savvy, what the search and rescue folks want you to know. With COVID, it's caused so many people to head into the backcountry nowadays. They want to escape the crowds, find some solace, a little bit of beauty, and of course the adventure. But what's really important is that everybody knows the basic of avalanche awareness and preparedness out there prior to heading out. If not, you may be the one that's calling 911 and being rescued. Sorry, I forgot to move my thing here. It might be you call 911 and you might have to be rescued by your local search and rescue, and we want to avoid that scenario. So today we got a couple presenters this evening. One is AJ Maheu. He is an avalanche forecaster for the North Shore Rescue. He's a professional member of the Canadian Avalanche Association and an avalanche skills training instructor. AJ has been a ski patroller for 15 years and he's been an Avy tech for over 20 years. As well, we have Lisa Paulson, visitor safety specialist for Banff, Yoho, and Kootenay National Parks. She's an ACMG mountain guide, professional member of the CAA as well, and she also teaches AST courses. Lisa's been part of the park safety for 25 years, but her true roots really started being a lifty at Lake Louise on the Paradise Chair. Both of our speakers today have extensive experience in the backcountry rescues. They're going to share their knowledge on the do's and the don'ts of backcountry travel so that you don't become a rescue statistic. So I'm going to pass it along to AJ now, and hope you folks enjoy this evening's presentation.
Okay, thank you, Brent. You can hear me fine?
Yeah, we hear you loud and clear.
Okay, wonderful. Let me share my screen here. Okay, just confirming we're in business. Perfect. So good evening. What I wanted to do with this presentation is to explore a little bit the concept of vulnerability. So we talk a lot about companion rescue and avalanche rescue and things like that, but I want in this presentation to actually go beyond this, because often the companion rescue, the digging the person out is unfortunately actually the easy part, and then everything gets a lot more complicated. There's a lot of info to cover in a typical avalanche course, no matter what the level is, and it's rare that we actually have that opportunity to explore these concepts and really think about our vulnerability when we're out in the backcountry. So I'm going to start with just a little quick, it might be a review for a lot of you, but the difference between hazard and risk, right? So in order to establish the avalanche hazard, we first assess the likelihood of avalanches, and that's based on sensitivity to triggers and the spatial distribution of the problem. The destructive size has more to do with the propagation potential of the layer, the size of the terrain, the depth of the layer, and things like that. This information you get from the avalanche bulletin. That's avalanche hazard. Risk is what you choose to do with that information. Essentially, risk is choosing to expose yourself to that hazard, right? Your first line of defense always to manage your risk, of course, is to eliminate your exposure. But because of the nature of what we do in the backcountry, that's not necessarily always possible or even maybe desirable. So every time you choose to expose yourself to a hazard, it's not enough to just understand that you're doing it. You also have to carefully assess your vulnerability. Now, if you're not familiar with Brene Brown, she's a popular author. She's a social worker by trade, I believe, and she's doing a lot of great work about vulnerability, but she essentially mostly deals with emotional vulnerability. And maybe my statement here on the screen is not all that fair to her. I think that her message actually has its place in avalanche terrain, but maybe more in the group dynamics and how we deal with each other. But this lecture is not about that. This lecture is very much about the physical world. And no matter what Ms. Brown has to say about vulnerability, when it comes to the physical world, vulnerability is not something to be celebrated. You know, vulnerability basically is a terrible thing that we actually want to reduce as much as possible. So your vulnerability actually refers to your inability to withstand the effect of a hostile environment. And for us, you know, that's avalanche terrain. Now, another important concept is the idea of a window of vulnerability. Because when we realize that we're vulnerable, the first thing that we do is we establish layers of protection, right? And these layers of protection are never perfect. And in some cases, they can actually either be diminished or compromised or lacking in one way or another. So what does that mean for us when we go travel in the backcountry? I say here on this slide, we're going to talk about the inner circle, because the first thing we're going to talk about is the actual avalanche itself. You know, being exposed or caught in an avalanche, and how we manage that. As far as the long or medium, I should say, and long-term consequences of that involvement, we're going to talk about that and explore that concept a little bit later, right? So the first question is, how hostile is your environment? So, you know, the likelihood of avalanche and size of expected avalanches, that's essentially the avalanche hazard that we talked about earlier. But then there's more to that, right? There's the terrain traps, for example. And, you know, that can affect your survivability of an involvement. And then you have to ask yourself, how strong is your safety net, right? So part of our layers of protection against that hazard will involve our terrain choice. What is your escape strategy? So, you know, whenever you enter a slope, you always wonder, like, if that slope slides, what am I going to do about it? Where am I going, right? Are you using good travel practices? What about rescue equipment and skills and protective equipment? And so when we think about these layers being inadequate or failing in some ways, you know, maybe you're familiar with Reason's model, and a lot of people refer to that as the Swiss cheese model, right? Each of these layers that we put up to protect ourselves may actually fail. And so if we talk about terrain choices, for example, you know, how can that fail? Well, maybe when you left the parking lot, you said, you know, I'm going to stay away from north aspects today based on the bulletin and everything we know about north aspects. I don't like them. But then, you know, you travel in the terrain and then the snow looks so good on that north aspect that you start to come up with some half-baked justification on why it actually might be okay, right? So that would be a failure of your terrain choice. About your escape strategy. So maybe you didn't have a safe exit plan because you didn't think about it. Or maybe you underestimated how difficult it would be to pull it off. Like, it's one thing to say, if it slides, I'm going to ski up to that high point. but it's quite something different to try to do it when the snow is actually moving. Maybe you're also traveling, maybe you're skinning or snowshoeing, or you're a little bit more vulnerable because you can't really get out of the way. Same thing for ice climbing or even taking a picture. Good travel practice, failure in that, well, you know, they're pretty common. So maybe you have multiple people exposed at the same time. Why did you decide to ski together at the same time on the slope? Well, who knows? But this is a kind of mistakes that we make. This is a window of vulnerability where that good travel practice, for some reason or another, sometimes it's just poor communication, that layer failed, right? Rescue equipment and skills, well, you know, maybe somebody in your group found a really good deal on an older transceiver on Craigslist that might not be completely reliable. Maybe the pins in your shovel that hold the shovel together break. I broke 2 of them this season. Maybe the cable inside your probe is frayed a little bit. And also your skills, like when was the last time that you practiced challenging scenarios? It's one thing to find a transceiver 30 centimeters under the snow, but practicing like deep burials or multiple burials with close proximity and things like that. So keeping our skills up all the time. And then protective equipment. So maybe you have an airbag, but maybe you forgot to actually get the trigger out of the shoulder strap, or maybe you forgot to put the leg strap on. So all of these layers are good, but they all have the potential to fail us. And so this is supposed to be the perspective of search and rescue on avalanche rescue. And the sad reality here is that when it comes to avalanche rescue, there is only one kind of rescue, and that's companion rescue. And I'm sure you've heard that before. It's not to say that SAR has no role here, but the role of SAR is really just to show up after the fact to help you pick up the pieces. But you've seen this graphic also probably before, and we don't have to elaborate on it for very long for you to realize that the chance of survival between the time of burial and the time organized search and rescue shows up, the numbers just don't add up. So for the first part of it, you are most definitely on your own. So we're gonna explore a little bit of a scenario here. And this scenario is heavily inspired by real events. And it's a ski scenario because that's my default setting. I'm a skier, but I'm a little bit curious to see what the audience is made of. So maybe we can have a little poll here just to see how many, just to have a little bit of a breakdown of how you access the backcountry. So Brent, is this working? I don't have it on my, I don't have the poll.
All right. Yeah, we got the poll there, AJ. It looks like 68% of the folks are skiers or split boarders. We got 3% are from the snowmobile, snowbike crowd. Snowshoe makes up 27%. And then we got a few, the 2% ice climbing out there. So that's your results on the poll.
All right, wonderful. Okay. Close this, perfect. So, you know, if you're not a skier, just bear with me. It still works. The idea here is ultimately somebody's going to get caught in an avalanche and you're going to have to deal with it. So if you're not a skier, just tweak the scenario a little bit, but ultimately the reflection is going to be the same. So here's my scenario. You're with 2 friends, and your objective is to ski this seldom skied chute there. You have to rappel in The rappel is not important. I just thought it looks way cooler if we rappel into the chute. It's a long day trip. So you left the car pretty early and you're actually expected to be back at the car probably after sunset. But you're okay with that and you're prepared for it. So it's now 2 o'clock and you're at the top of your line, you're fired up, you're pretty tired because it was a pretty long hike to get there. But you're excited for your run. And then you go first. And of course you ski flawlessly right in the middle of the chute. It's perfect, like 30 centimeters of fresh powder. Just an amazing run. Second skier drops in, crisscrosses your tracks and join you at the same point at the bottom. Now the third skier, she wanted to get a little bit, because after 2 skiers it was tracked a little bit. So she went a little bit over to the left to try to get some untracked snow and got close to the rocks and triggered a size 2 avalanche that bounced off a large rock at the bottom of the chute. And she's fully buried. So that's where we're at. So of course, the first thing you do, like I said earlier, you're on your own for the first part, but you were quick and you found her and you did a really good job. So that's wonderful. The problem though is that as you dig her out, well, you realize, she's alive, she's conscious, she's breathing on her own, but she has a pretty nasty lower leg fracture and about 10 centimeters of tibia is exposed and it's still actively bleeding. She's shivering vigorously. Because remember, it was a pretty big hike to get up there, and your base layer and everything is pretty wet, and she's been buried in the snow for a while. But she's out and she's breathing. So you take a minute to evaluate your situation. So it's -12. There's light wind and it's snowing a little bit. Visibility is pretty poor. Ski penetration is about 30 centimeters. There's no other groups on that side of the mountain. You do have a satellite personal locator device, like a Spot or an Inreach. You have a cell phone as well, but there's no cellular reception. In order to get out, you actually have to ski back up to the ridge and gain about 400 meters of elevation before you can actually start to ski down. You're in the Alpine, you have a decent first aid kit, and you have a rescue toboggan with you. So let's try to address all of these concerns or hazard one by one, right? So at this point, your friend can't move. She's lying in the snow. She's already very cold and she's gonna get much colder pretty quick. So you need to get her off the ground, make sure that she's dry to protect her from the wind and the snow that's falling. Now ask yourself, with the gear that you normally take on a day trip, whether you're a snowmobiler or a snowshoer or a skier, we all have this typical day pack that we carry. Do you have enough gear in there to do this, right? So the hazard here is a hostile environment. Like -12 is not that bad, but if you're lying in the snow, it's certainly bad enough, right? So what's at risk here is the core temperature, of course, of your patient, but also ultimately yours, the extremity of the patient. And this is a pretty serious injury. So ultimately, it can actually even put the life of certainly the patient, if not the whole group, at risk. So layers of protection we have against this, of course, extra warm layers, and maybe an emergency shelter. You don't have that in your bag or not nearly enough of extra warm layers, and that's a failure of that layer of protection. So it's a pretty serious injury. Definitive care, unfortunately, is pretty far away. So without advanced first aid, there's a good chance that your friend's condition is going to deteriorate. Her leg might actually be at risk, and if you can't manage to stop the bleeding, potentially her life could be at risk. So do you know how to do that? Do you know how to control that bleeding? Like, it's a little bit tricky with a compound fracture like this. You can't, it's not like any old bleeding that you can just put pressure on. How about improvising a leg splint? Because it's unlikely that you're going to have a proper leg splint in your backpack. So the hazard here is injury aggravation. There is an injury there, and the injury itself is not a hazard per se, but that injury will tend to actually get worse. And you know, with 10 centimeters of tibia exposed with active bleeding, you're talking about, you know, of course, bleeding, bone infection, problems like that. And it could potentially put her life, or certainly her leg, at risk. Layers of protection to help with that. A first aid kit, I mean, it's limited what you can do with a first aid kit in that situation. And, you know, advanced wilderness first aid training. If you don't have those, then that's a failure of that layer. So more question. In order to get out, you have to go back up a ridge and gain about 400 meters of elevation gain. Ski penetration is 30 centimeters. If you've ever tried to drag somebody in one of those or any toboggan for that matter, you quickly realize that this is actually not super realistic. So your best bet is to hunker down. It's great, you know, good on you for having that little toboggan, but if you skipped having a warm jacket or a shelter in favor of that toboggan, you may not have actually made the more or the best choice there. Because with just the two of you, I don't think it's reasonable to think that you're going to drag that person 400 meters up the ridge. So you're going to have to wait for help. So the hazard here is rapid access to definitive care is compromised, and the life or limb of the patient is at risk because of that delay. As far as layer of protection, well, you do have an emergency toboggan, but you just don't have the manpower to actually be able to pull it off, or maybe the conditions make it a little bit challenging. Okay, we carry on. You have a satellite device, but poor visibility. So SAR team won't be able to reach you quickly. So the satellite device only allows you to say, hey, we're in trouble. And then, you know, they're going to answer, well, you know, that's great, but the ceiling is too low and there's not enough visibility. We can't get to you. So all of a sudden, you're not just a little bit delayed. In all likelihood, you're going to have to spend the night. So, you know, when's the last time you slept in a snow cave? And then add to that the fact that your clothes are wet and you don't have a sleeping bag, and also the fact that you've used a bunch of your equipment to try to keep your victim or patient or whatever you want to call him warm and off the ground, and some of that stuff probably went into that improvised splint and so on. So your hazard here is the fact that you're isolated. There's delayed access. People just can't get to you strictly based on poor visibility. I mean, they can get to you. It's just going to take a very long time to get there. And of course, that puts the life or limb of your patient at risk, and potentially also puts everybody at risk of hypothermia. As far as layer of protection, well, you do have a satellite device, but the fact that the visibility is poor is actually making that layer fail. So people know you're in trouble, they just can't really get to you. Another layer of protection would actually be to consider weather and visibility in your risk and vulnerability assessment, right? So it's one thing to be in trouble, it's a very different thing to be in trouble when there's no visibility and helicopters can't fly. So you can take a minute to play with that scenario, right? So you can tweak it, doesn't have to be a skier, but then you can put two people in the debris. You can change that leg injury and make it a spinal injury. You can ramp up the wind to 60 kilometers per hour and replace the light dry snow with rain. Maybe you forgot to recharge your Inreach. So now what? How are you going to actually call for help? Make it a group of 6. Maybe that changes things in a positive way. Maybe now you do have the manpower to actually climb back up the ridge. What if it's not your group and you're a witness to this? Are you prepared to help people? So, I often say there's two kinds of people in the backcountry. There are people who are a liability, and there are people who everybody is safer just because they're there. And that's what we're shooting for. So once we're able to manage our own risk, then we have to carry on beyond that. And we have to aim to a point where when I go out in the mountain, everybody is better off because I'm there. I mean, it's a bit of a pretentious statement. I wasn't really referring to me here, but that's what we should be shooting for. You can also change it to a 3 or 5 day traverse. In that case, you have much better shelter, you have, sleeping bags and foamies and all that stuff, but you're also probably likely a little bit more isolated. So it's a really good exercise to just take the time to think about these things and really think about them. And it's difficult when we're sitting at home comfortable thinking about these things to really remember how miserable we are when we're tired and cold and wet and it's getting dark. So it takes a little bit of mental effort to get there. So these are consequences, right? So it's very easy for things to go sideways and SAR to not be able to get to you. And I guess the goal of my presentation here is to open that window into that thinking, going, well, we all have that fail-safe. I said, well, we have the Inreach, we can always call SAR, but that's definitely not a good risk management strategy because it's a very poor layer of protection. So really think about the consequences. If something happens, really assess your vulnerability. Because you can only take calculated risk, right? We say that all the time. People, we need to calculate our risk and keep it reasonable. But there's a difference between blissful ignorance and calculated risk. And that difference is to truly assess your vulnerability and realize that it reaches far beyond the avalanche rescue itself. There's really only so much SAR can do to help the helpless. So if there is not a fair bit of self-reliance there, unfortunately, there's often not enough anyways that we can do. And we're not heroes. And let's imagine for a second Batman. And so I picked Batman because he doesn't have any special powers. He's just a guy, and he's fit and he's keen and he's got a whole bunch of gadgets. So and he's not all that different than a lot of search and rescue personnel. Actually, I know a few search and rescue technicians who think of themselves as Batman. But think for a second, if Batman had to obey occupational health and safety regulation, that would be a very, very different movie. And that's what SAR is about. In fact, my role as an avalanche forecaster is sometimes to make sure that I reel in the Batmans out there and say, whoa, 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 we can't go there. That's not safe. And my job is to make sure that no one takes unreasonable risks to perform a rescue. And it's a very, very difficult call to make, to decide to not go and to let somebody spend a night out because it's unsafe for us to go. But we will do that if we don't have a choice. And as I said earlier, a little bit of self-reliance really goes a long way. And finally, the 6P rule, that the proper preparation and planning prevents poor performance. There's actually a 7P, but it's probably not appropriate to say what the 7th P stands for. So preparation and planning is actually going to be covered by Lisa's presentation, who's following right after me. She's going to give you some great tools and tips and some good stories about how to prepare properly for backcountry travel. And that's all I got. So I'm open for questions here, if there are any.
Yeah, AJ, the question about helicopters. How
Yes.
much light would you need, say if there's a rescue going on at the end of the day, like how much light do you need before a helicopter could be deployed, assuming that there's visibility?
Yeah, visibility is a big one because for us on the North Shore right now, we're actually in a pilot project where we have been authorized to use night vision goggles, so we can fly even if it is dark. The problem with night vision goggles is that it's not a silver bullet, in the sense that we need better visibility at night. So we need 3 miles visibility at night in order to fly with the night vision goggles, as opposed to a mile and a half during the daytime. And ultimately, it always comes down to the pilot's decision. So, if I'm responsible to say we're not going on that slope because it's unsafe, the pilot is responsible to say I can't fly because there's not enough light.
Great, thank you. That's it from the floor right now. There might be more coming.
Yeah, I got nothing from the floor as well right now, AJ. How about I'll ask folks out there, what is your level of Avy Savvy out there? I'm going to launch another poll. Like basically, what kind of avalanche training do you have out there, folks? Just get you guys to fill up that poll. And if we don't get more questions for AJ, we're probably just going to move into her presentation. So it looks like, yeah, as far as training, it looks like almost half of you folks out there today have an AST1. 14% of you have no avalanche training or education, and 17% of you have a basic awareness. 15% have an AST2, and then we got almost 10% got pro level training out there as well. That's great to see, and we have a total like 476 folks out here tonight.
Hey AJ, I've gotten a couple more questions here. From Keegan, what do you pack in your bag for a day of touring?
Ooh, it does vary, actually. It varies a lot depending on the terrain and the weather conditions that I'm expecting. So, there's the whole part of whether we're going to be on glaciated terrain, and then so you have the rope and everything. What conditions we're going to expect? Well, sometimes I'll have crampons or ski crampons, and sometimes I won't necessarily carry that. But I would say certainly that one thing that never changes is that I always ask myself, okay, so what if something happens and we have to spend the night? And I'm not someone, I don't like carrying heavy loads more than anyone else, but I've gotten really crafty at, very light system to make sure that I can get, somebody who's hurt off the ground, that we can get protected from the precipitation and wind and stay warm. Generally, my approach is more to get ready to hunker down and wait for help rather than to self-evacuate, primarily because I typically travel in pretty small groups. If you travel generally in large group, then the idea of self-evacuation might be a little bit more accessible. So I'm sorry I don't have like an actual list, and I think that this can vary as long as the guiding principle is to be self-reliant, primarily to be able to hunker down and wait for help. I think that's a really good first starting point.
Great, thanks AJ. There's a bunch of others now. From Lisa, due to COVID, many of us are traveling in smaller groups this season, 2 or 3 people total. At what point in an avalanche burial do you recommend calling SAR? I've heard arguments for initiating SOS as soon as the avalanche happens, and other arguments for getting to the victim and their airway cleared first.
Yeah, that's of course a difficult question. I think that ultimately, if somebody is under the snow, the ultimate priority is to get not just the airway, but the airway in the chest of that person out, so because sometimes the airway is clear, but the chest is still compressed by the snow. So, you know, that's the thing that is the most time sensitive. And realistically, you know, even if it's a deep burial, it shouldn't take much more than a few minutes from, you know, judging by the level of training that we have in this group here. So, you know, delaying calling SAR 15 minutes in order to get to the airway, I think is absolutely reasonable, because SAR doesn't really play a role in getting to that airway and make sure that this person is breathing. Of course, we want to get SAR called as quickly as possible, but if somebody is actually under the snow, then that's probably better to go straight for that. Another thing to consider as well, and that's a message that we've been trying to promote with search and rescue, is do not delay calling SAR. This, you know, despite what I just said about getting to the airway, you know, if you think you're going to need help, call right away. What we want to avoid is people delaying calling to the point where they are desperate, because things don't get better, they typically get worse. And if they call by the time they get desperate, then generally we don't have as much daylight left, and we have people who are in a very serious situation. We'd much rather have the call early on before things are desperate.
Great, thanks, AJ. Question from Johan. If you had to choose between bringing an emergency bivy sack or emergency shelter, which would you bring, for example, for the situation you described?
I'm a much bigger fan of the emergency shelter for multiple reasons. It's much more versatile. One of the big things in first aid in general, but even more so in wilderness first aid in that particular scenario, that's going to be extremely difficult, is to keep that person warm. And now there's 3 of you. There's the victim and 2 giant hot packs. That's the 2 unhurt people. If you have an emergency shelter, you can use your body heat under that tarp or that bothy bag or whatever it is that you have to actually all stay warm. The problem with the BV bag is the patient is alone in there, so they get colder. The 2 other people are not protected from the environment. Plus, getting somebody with a broken leg inside a BV bag is actually pretty difficult. So, you know, I think that the emergency shelter is much more versatile than the BV bag for that.
Thanks, AJ. Another one from Franz. What is the best method to mark your location to be visible from the air?
That's a very good question. Lights are good, even, you know, if you have like a really high-powered headlamps, even in daytime. Mirrors can also be spotted from helicopters quite effectively. And then, of course, there's things like flares and smoke flares and things like that. Most people don't really carry that around. Flagging tape can be used as well. And I don't know, I'm sort of drawing a little bit of a blank on that, and maybe Lisa or other people on the panel have more to say about that.
Yeah, you know what, I'll give you one more and then we'll move on to Lisa. There's lots of questions, but I think Lisa might be covering some of these as well. From Dasha, can you recommend any good resources or links that outline the best way to make a snow cave or shelter if you're forced to stay overnight?
You know, I think the best thing you can do is, you know, there's tons of videos on YouTube and such, but the best thing you can do is to go out and do it, because, you know, snow caves, well, yeah, they're great, but I have yet to figure out a way to dig a snow cave and not be completely soaked at the end of the project. So one exercise that I've done with some skiing friends that is really eye-opening is to go out for a day of touring and finish the day close to a hut, and just carry your day pack. And at the end of the day, just don't go in the hut. Make it close to a hut, because it makes things a whole lot safer if things don't work out. But dig a snow cave or use a bothy bag, or and just spend a night with the stuff that you have. But having done the day of touring ahead of time is actually an important part, because you are tired and you're a little bit wet, and it is just incredibly miserable. And it's not a fun exercise, but it's really eye-opening. So I think that the best resource is just going out and trying it. And otherwise, I mean, there's millions of YouTube videos about these things, and you can generally pick out the hokey one from the reputable ones.
That's great, AJ, thanks. I'll let Lisa take over, and then we'll see if we can get back to some of these.
You're muted there, Lisa.
Hello, that's probably better. I'm going to share my screen. You should see my presentation now.
Looks good.
That's great. Okay. I just got to click one more thing. So hi, everyone. My name's Lisa Paulson. I'm with Parks Canada, Visitor Safety. And what an incredible privilege to be able to talk to 475 of you from my house. That's amazing. And to share some messages from our SAR team, just general messages. And I think, when I think of rescue, and I've been doing it for a while now, 25 years or so, what really resonates with me is nobody goes out there with any intention of wanting to be rescued. That's far from our minds when we head out on a trip, for sure. So what I want to cover with you is just a few aspects, whether you are a new user, an intermediate user, or maybe even a pro user. You might find a few tips through this presentation. I'm going to walk you through some of the ways that you can aim not to meet me or any of my SAR team members. And then in the middle third, I'm going to give you a quick tour of some of those online tools that you can use in your trip planning to avoid meeting me or any of my team members. And then I'm going to sort of intermingle through this how I've noticed SAR has changed in my career. And then in the end, what if you just really want to meet me or one of my colleagues? Some of the tips there that can give you some preparation for our arrival and how to get a hold of us. So in preparation for this presentation, I had a little bit of fun. I went into our computer database, or I think it's fun because I look after the database, but I queried it. I was like, okay, so what are the contributing factors to our accidents from 2017 onward? And I came up, I'm not sure if folks can see my mouse, but in the lower right, came up with a little bit of a graph of how things look. And I found that contributing factors, often we find people choose trips that are potentially exceeding their abilities, maybe a little inexperience, inadequate equipment, judgment issues, fatigue, slippery trails. So from that, I picked 5 main themes in how you can prevent needing a SAR member. First off, right here, pick the right trip. And this is sounds super basic, but it's super important. Just like what AJ was mentioning, the winter's severe, travel's harder, temperature's colder, daylight's short. So we need to be careful in what we pick. So you want to pick something that's going to be right for your group as a whole, whether you're snowshoe, walking, ice climbing, skiing, snowmobiling. Pick something that's easily achievable within the skill sets of your group. Pick something you can manage yourself and your group with ease. There's no stress there. And keep in mind that just because you can do it and think it's a grand idea, it doesn't mean your whole team can. There could be a tendency to start to split up and separate, but always remember you want to stick together and not separate. And if you're still kind of scratching your head like, oh, I don't know where to start, well, here in Parks Canada, we have some tools for you. You can start off with speaking to somebody at one of our information centers. Every national park and provincial park, we have these wonderful information centers where these people are pros at helping you pick an appropriate trip. But of course, in COVID times, you can't just walk into these buildings. So I've also here, you can take out your phone, take a snapshot of the screen here, or you could just Google it on your own time, look at our national park pages, and you can send info staff an email, or you can phone them. They're at the ready to help guide you and help you select an appropriate trip given what your background is. They can also, if you have more technical kind of questions, maybe it's ice climbing condition related or forecast related, avalanche forecast related, they can punt your call over to one of the visitor safety specialists who can explore your question in a more technical fashion and give you some advice. And whatever you do, you want to think, you want to have a plan B. And our info staff and we can collectively help you come up with that if you need assistance doing that. So that's step number one, tip one. Tip two, and this again is going to sound pretty basic, but you'd be surprised at how many incidents revolve around not having the appropriate clothing and footwear. It comes down to that vulnerability thing. So this might speak to the crowd that's kind of maybe starting to get into it a bit and starting to get the gear. It's a lot to invest in, but really give it some thought before you just march off on a trail. Give you an example, like it was just, I think last year, and this is a fairly common tale, Lake Louise, if you're familiar with the Rockies, is here. Banff and Calgary is heading off to the right side of the image. And Moraine Lake is the lake at the bottom of the screen. There's a party of two that thought they'd just go for a little walk. And they started to follow the Moraine Lake Trail, which is a beautiful cross-country ski trail. If you haven't skied it, it's gorgeous. And it's track set right up until you get near the Avalanche Train. All our track set trails are outside of Avalanche Train. But this couple, they decided to carry on a little further and they made it all the way into Moraine Lake, a 12-kilometer walk in the winter, in their running shoes, light jackets, and they got to Moraine Lake and there was no cell coverage. They were completely cold, tired, exhausted. They weren't going to be able to leave Moraine Lake. Fortunately for them, the Moraine Lake payphone was working and they were able to call for rescue. And just like AJ alluded, rescue doesn't happen just like that. It took, a couple of hours before rescue teams from 3 communities got together, got to Lake Louise, got the snowmobiles, and were able to sled up and pick up this couple. So the moral of the story is really think about, before you leave your car, what you've got for clothing and footwear. And some of our trails in the winter, anywhere in the mountains, can get quite icy. So think about investing in some ice cleats, hike with some ski poles, and that can prevent this other most common injury we have is the slip fall on the trail. The next thing you want to think about is, doesn't matter where you go in the mountains, as soon as you go into the mountains, you got to think that avalanche terrain is closer than you think. And we all want to stay out of that terrain if we don't know what that terrain is. And if you are in that camp and you're new and you just want nothing to do with avalanche terrain, again, remember our information centers, and I'll show you some brochures and stuff that you can look at, and you can stick to designated winter trails. You have to keep in mind that as soon as we have a slope and some snow on the slope, we could have potentially an avalanche problem. And this was a very sad story of a couple of tobogganers, a fellow and his son, left the chateau, Lake Louise. Can you guys see my mouse? Maybe somebody can unmute and just make sure, see my mouse, but circling the head of Lake Louise. And
we can see your mouse floating around there, Lisa.
Yeah. Oh, okay, cool. Anyways, they left the Lake Louise trailhead here and crossed the lake and ended up picking this slope to toboggan on. And that was right in the heart of some avalanche terrain and some high hazard. I'm pretty sure he had no idea that's the kind of hazard they were walking into. So be aware that that terrain exists, and it exists closer than you think. So if you want to see clear of that, make sure you do your research before you go talk to the information centers. Make sure you go to a designated trail that's a winter trail to avoid that terrain. This did not end well, and both were buried. And the cool news is that if you wanted to start to get a little bit more aware, you can become a little more Avy Savvy. And in the middle part of the presentation, I'm going to show you how to find that resource so you can learn more. And it's free. The next common pitfall is in the realm of navigation. And I'm curious here, because this is somewhere where I've seen a lot of change in the years of rescue. What do people mostly use for navigation? And Brent, or one of you, I think you have a poll you could launch that we could see where people sit with what they use for navigation. And see if I can pull up the results too and see. So go to your poll and click on what you use.
Yeah, it looks like we got about 75% of the people voted. Yeah, that's pretty
awesome.
good. Can you see the results there, Lisa?
Yeah, so I see, I'm pleased to hear that you use a combination. That's a strong approach. Lots of using maps on the phone. I like that too. And we're gonna roll through some of the advantages of that combined effort. Just getting things pop up on the screen here, just gonna move. Okay, that's awesome. So what I've been noticing is, yeah, people are using these modern navigation tools or a combination of tools, which I think is strong. There are many map apps, like on your phone, you can download probably many, it looks like many of you have many map apps, trail apps, Gaia, CalTopo, and they're pretty slick and people can start to rely on them. But we are starting to get more rescues these days where the phone dies and then they've lost their main navigation tool. And some people, unlike this crowd, they don't have a backup and then they find they can't continue. The other kind of recipe that we've started to see is that when you look at some of these map apps, you'll see lots of options and routes that people have cared to publish. Not all those routes are wise routes. And we have had incidents where people have followed a route and then needed rescue, and then people the next week followed the same route and they needed rescue. That happened in Kananaskis. They had a frequent flyer that they had to address on this particular map where people are falling into the same pitfall. So be aware of that. Don't put all your eggs or confidence in a track you see on your phone map, or for that matter, you know, a line drawn in a guidebook. You always want to question it and do some more research on those routes and have that backup. This is a story, if you guys are familiar with Highway 93 North leading from Lake Louise up to Jasper. There's a couple of boys that went to do the Dolomite Circuit, a beautiful tour, ski tour. And they were supposed to be back in time to watch Star Wars with their dad, but up here it got into a bit of a whiteout condition. They lost their bearing, their phone didn't work, and they didn't have any backup, and they sort of dropped down north into this drainage, and all the while thought they were still circumnavigating Mount Dolomite, because you make the terrain fit to your situation. And we picked them up the next day. They spent the night out in here. So having those backups, having, you know, the proper topographical map, a real compass, not just your phone, altimeter on your watch that you've you know, corrected for elevation. Learn how to use them. And if you don't know how to use them, then consider taking some training. And this is, I've got this up here, the Association of Canadian Mountain Guides. There's a website there, and there's a listing of guides. You can find guides in your region. There's several guiding companies, and there are many courses that you could take, or, you know, have something tailored by a guide to teach you how to do some navigation, or check out some online tutorials as well. So that's my plug for navigation. And then another one is print your route descriptions and bring them with you. Don't rely on the electronic copy. And the last tip, tip 5, before we go on to the online tools, is apply the avalanche forecast. And to learn to apply the avalanche forecast, you need to have a little bit of training if you're going to start to go into avalanche terrain and wonder how to apply it. And many in this crowd have already taken their avalanche skills training 1. Some might have moved on to their managing avalanche terrain course, or companion rescue skills course, or even their AST2. And I'm going to show you how to find some of that stuff in a moment. Many accidents can be prevented if you really apply all pieces of that avalanche forecast. The incident here I'm showing you is a snowshoeing incident, and the lead of the trip we knew had an AST1, and he was bringing some friends that didn't have any training. We're not sure what resources he checked before he went. It's a bit of a sad story. Again, it's quite close to a trailhead, and they're in avalanche terrain. And we were in triple high hazard, meaning high hazard in the alpine, tree line below tree line. We had a pretty touchy layer that we were describing. And sadly, they walked underneath this slope and remote triggered it. 2 of the 4 were buried critically and then fatally, sadly. But had they read the forecast and applied it, maybe they wouldn't have been there. So now I'm going to just jump in. Oh, I have a poll too. I'm curious because I've been forecasting a long time too. And I was back in the day where I'd write the bulletin, and then we'd drive to the trailhead, we'd pin it up at the trailhead and record it on the phone. And I always wondered how many people actually listen to it. So I'm really curious these days, how many people or how often do you read the avalanche forecast? And maybe Brent, you can launch that poll. Oh, we're getting 78% voted, and we've got, that's pretty neat, 36% weekly, 30% daily, 27 only before I go out. Oh, fair enough. So that's out of 471 people. Wow. That's good reach for the forecast. That's awesome. So I'm going to now launch. I'm going to have to do a little switch and show you some cool links that might help if you're just getting started out. Some things that you might want to be aware of. So I just have to have training in this. I can do it. Okay, here we go. So you should see my.
Yeah, good to go.
Yeah, cool, good. So I'm just going to take you through like about a few tabs here, six tabs quickly. And here we go. I'm going to start, well, I am from Parks Canada, so I have to start with the Parks Canada page. It's actually pretty good. Every national park, you can just Google the national park, and there's some great tabs to sort of help guide, plan your visit. Important bulletins are helpful, trail conditions down here. Something that's particularly popular, you can get into the brochures. Every park has a section on winter brochures. So if you're looking for that terrain or that trip, things you can do that's not an avalanche terrain, you would be interested in checking out some of these winter trail brochures. And there's cross-country skiing, there's snowshoeing options in there. If you're starting to venture into avalanche terrain and you've taken some of your training and you have the proper equipment, you could look at some of the terrain ratings here. We've used the avalanche terrain exposure scale to rate some popular ski trips and ice climbing. And Avalanche Canada has also some really great links where it has maps of what pieces of terrain are rated. And those are just a really good tool that you learn about in the avalanche skills training or the Avy Savvy course and how to apply it. If you ended up in the park and you haven't had a chance to speak to anybody from the information center and you'd like to just go for a walk, you're at one of our popular trailheads, pay attention to these signs. These signs are at not all of our trailheads, but many of the popular ones, and they will show you where that hazardous terrain is so that you could go for a walk and stay out of the avalanche terrain, which is all this pink terrain, basically open areas clear of trees. So pay attention to those as you're out walking around in the national parks. Now here's the gem. And I'm guessing a lot of you are very familiar with this because there's a lot of response people following the forecast. But if you're new, look at this. You can just start here. How good is that? And you get right into following. You're fresh to the backcountry, start here. And you find that a bit interesting. You can carry on to some free online training. Avy Savvy. You might have heard about this already, but it's brand new this year and it's really good. It's super interactive, lots of great videos, ways to increase your knowledge, some great case studies. And now you still want to learn more? Well, this is where you can find those courses I was talking about. You can find a provider, find a course, super helpful. Events, you guys all know this is where you found your webinar. You can also find the recorded webinars. You want to learn more? Maybe you're in the sledding community. There's some stuff specifically for you. Maybe you want to bring avalanche awareness to your community, to your school. There's a bunch of youth links here, and you can contact Avalanche Canada. They can help you bring that to your community. Super awesome. And then Backcountry Resources, I think we had some questions. Well, what kind of gear should you carry? What do you carry? Well, there's a list right here, essential gear. There's trip planning tools, forecasters blogs, some great background on some avalanche problems or things going on in the snowpack. This is a deep site. There's lots to check it out on the site. And if you hear us talking about the MIN, I was thinking we could launch another poll, but I forgot to mention, I was wondering how many people here have actually created a MIN. MIN is the Mountain Information Network, and you go out on a trip and you can select this little blue dot down here. Doesn't matter who you are, anybody can contribute and provide valuable information. And it shows up as a blue dot. It gives you some questions. You can throw on a picture, describe what you've experienced and saw. Super helpful to us as forecasters. For those that you contribute, I say thank you because it's really helpful for us in the forecasting community as well. These dots, you know, the ones sadly with the black and the red, those are the fatalities we've had this winter. The ones with the white dot and blue background, those are submitted by guides. And this one I just noticed new today. I'm gonna have to read it. It's got the red dot, blue background. That's somebody that's had an avalanche incident of some sort. Super valuable contributing that. You have an incident out there and you give that to us, that's like gold information for us. So thank you for submitting those, and we're glad it was blue background, that you survived that. There are lots of things. All the bulletin regions are here. That's super cool, whether it's from Avalanche Canada or Parks Canada, Kananaskis Country. And you can change the filter on it. So, you know, what you see in terms of the information, you can change it 7 days if you've been away, 3 days. If you check it weekly, you might want the 7-day. Daily, I have it set for 3 days so I don't miss anything. There's weather stations you can check. And if you haven't yet, this is awesome on the phone. So even while I'm talking here, if you haven't downloaded the app on your phone, you definitely want that, because that's my preferred way of looking at the weather stations. Whenever I see weather stations, I think I want to look at it on my phone. So amazing site. We are so fortunate to have this at our fingertips. Another cool thing out of this site is the mountain weather forecast. Amazing. We have every morning, look at this, 4 a.m., those Environment Canada forecasters in Vancouver and in the Edmonton office make these wonderful synopses for us, and we get an understanding in English what's going on with the weather. So I check all the site out as my morning newspaper. Then you can dial down into the forecasts, and when I say, you know, dig into the forecasts, you'll learn how to do this on those AST courses. How to look at just the first level, the danger rating and trend, what the problems are, where you're going to find them, what you do, what to do with them, where to go, where not to go. But you have to remember also to dig down even further and go into the forecast details, where you can get that quick snapshot on what we're expecting with the weather, what the snowpack looks like, and any avalanche activity that's going on. And in the Parks Canada forecast, I'd like to alert you to a couple of numbers at the bottom here. Depending which region you're going into, they'll have different numbers, obviously, but you'll have the direct emergency number for the emergency dispatch for the Banff dispatch or Jasper dispatch. But you'll also have that number where you can call and ask a forecaster a question if you need clarity on how to apply this to your trip. You can also link back to some of these other resources we've talked about. And if you want to look back at any bulletin from past days, you can just click here and put in the date and maybe learn a bit more about what happened on the December 25th, create that layer we're talking about. Who knows? So great there. National parks, I also have to say, if you are in the Golden Revelstoke community or you're thinking of recreating in Glacier National Park, you should know that you need a winter permit for most of the areas there. So you can drill down in the national parks, Glacier Park, Ski Touring, Rogers Pass, and learn about how to get your permits. Actually, I did it, and it doesn't take too long, and it's quite interesting, actually. So worth doing if you're going to recreate there. A couple other sites I'll just show you before jumping back in presentation is a couple of Facebook pages. So Parks Mountain Safety from Parks Canada. This is where we put in extra information. It could be profiles, it could be videos. It runs summer, winter, and it's just our way of giving you some more information. Kananaskis Public Safety also has a similar Facebook page and super valuable. So those are some of the quick online tools that might be helpful to you as you are gearing up to start to do more in the backcountry. So I'm going to flip back to my presentation. Here we go. Did the links. Super fun. But say you did all that great work and you did all that trip planning, but you still, now something's happened and you really want to meet somebody from search and rescue. You know, no one is immune. I've needed rescue. Some members I work with have needed rescue. And even though we tend to try and be more careful in the backcountry to prevent needing that rescue, anyone can get hurt. And really it happens just very quickly. So similar to what AJ said, what's your plan? Ooh. So over the years, there's been a few things that have changed in rescue, and probably one of the biggest impacts is how we are notified. So I'm a bit curious as to what devices people in this audience carry. And maybe, Brent, you can launch that third poll and people can tell me what they carry. So just jump into your poll. And I'm curious what kind of emergency communication devices you carry. Wow. Isn't that 72? That's fantastic. Nearly over half the people have a spot or an Inreach. That's fascinating. And everybody has a cell phone these days. Cool. Well, we're gonna go through a few of those things. I'm gonna just explain to some of you, you know, how this has changed our lives in the rescue world. You know, it wasn't too long ago that when I got notified of a rescue, it would go something like this. Somebody, a spouse, would phone me or a parent, and they would say their spouse was skiing somewhere in the mountain parks. Hopefully they had a vehicle description for me, make, model, color, or a license plate, and hopefully a parking lot I could go check. And then we'd do that. We'd go check, see if the vehicle was there. If it was there, we'd put a note on it stating, you know, a search has been initiated for you. Call this number if you're back as soon as possible so we can not search for you any longer. That still happens occasionally, but not as frequently. You know, once we find the vehicle, we then would call back your contact person and pepper them with a bunch of questions, and we're hopeful they have the answers because we want to sort of assess maybe the urgency of the situation or where the person might be. And we'd be asking questions like, well, is there any possibility there's been some miscommunication, or has the person missed work or missed some engagement? What was the nature of their trip? Was it a multi-day trip, or was it supposed to be a short day trip? And then we'd look at it. Were they going over any hazardous terrain, or were the conditions hazardous? Did anybody in the party have a medical condition? What were their skill sets? What kind of equipment did they carry? Do they carry some of these emergency devices? What was their knowledge of the area? Are they new to it, or have they gone there, they know it well? Those are all sort of things that sort of help us gauge what we need to do in terms of response. And we, you know, hopefully that person has all that information. But there are cases where we don't get that information, as was the case in a Mount Hector search that we did. We didn't know to go there initially. It started with a hotel operator phoning us to say these people didn't check out of their hotel. And you know, upon investigation, as we've worked with the RCMP, we had no clue really where to start. They had a rental car, and we went into their room with the RCMP and started to look for clues of what they could have been doing, and involved searching the room, searching Facebook, social media pages, working with the cell phone company to get the last known point of their phone. Just looking for any clue, what was their last known point and what could they have been doing? Where should we start the search? We didn't know if they were ice climbing, skiing, or whatever. You can imagine this investigation takes time, takes hours. Fortunately, in this case, a plow operator had noticed that morning a vehicle that had been parked in the parking lot for the second day or a few days. I can't quite recall, but we went up and investigated it, and looked logical that it belonged to this party we're looking for. And the SAR member just walked up to the edge of the path, looked up into the path, and saw some snowshoes sticking out of the avalanche debris. They were completely buried. Again, that story of you don't have to go far to get into avalanche terrain. You know, sadly, this happened probably a few days earlier. The avalanche hazard was increasing. We couldn't really get in there right away. and we had to make the area safe for ourselves. We did quite a bit of avalanche control in here, and then we were able to get into the terrain to dig them out. So this kind of story was fairly typical, you know, this is how they used to go. Or you'd have the other scenario where somebody has done that amazing effort and run out to get help. And sometimes they would get out in time and we would be able to get in there before sunset and rescue the people. Or sometimes it took days to get out, and by the time we got there, things weren't as optimistic. So that's how we used to roll. But now we have all these tools, and you guys have them, which is kind of exciting. And they do have their pitfalls. I'm going to go through just a few things about these devices and some of the hiccups we've noticed with responding with these when people call us in on these. So a cool thing you should know about the smartphone, and when you call 911, if you're in an area of good cell, when you call 911, your latitude and longitude gets displayed. And then if you are very clear and you say, I have a backcountry emergency and I'm in, I don't know, Jasper National Park or Kananaskis country, and I need backcountry search and rescue, that 911 operator will then have your location and be able to transfer you to the appropriate dispatch center. Pretty cool. The other tool that people used to use is satellite phones. Those are still around. We still get people, you know, certainly the more organized trips or professional trips, they might be carrying a satellite phone, but you should know 911 is not the number you want to call on a satellite phone. You want to know what the direct phone number is for the to initiate search and rescue. And you can find those, you know, if you're not in one of the national park areas listed here, you can take a photo again with your camera if you like of the screen. Often in the front of guidebooks, you can find these kinds of numbers. A good skill to learn is, again, the map reading skill. Be able to pick your location off the map so you can communicate that, latitude, longitude, UTM. Or learn how to get, you know, if you're using a mapping app off your phone, be able to know how to get that location. If you're in cell range, be able to get to the utility and the compass app. It's a little bit different on different phones, so you have to work with it, but you can get to a page where you see that latitude, longitude that you could communicate, or use a GPS. So here's, sounds like a lot of you, over 50%, which is kind of exciting, have one of these devices, which is exciting. If you haven't got one and you're considering getting one, consider getting one that you can text with. And if you're worried about costs, you know, there's lots of different subscription plans and to fit your needs. And you can generally put them on hold for periods of time that you're not using it. I know groups of people that actually share one between friends, and they just do a really good job before their trip, getting on their computer or their phone and updating their profile with their trip information. Not many people I found have done that very often, but I'd like to encourage you to do that because it's super helpful. We can talk to the Emergency Coordination Center and get all those details. It can be very helpful. The other cool things that these devices, I feel like a salesperson right now a little bit, but you can, some of them, if you don't text, you can pre-program the messages. So it can be pretty helpful to have the pre-programmed message back at the car driving home. That's helpful. You're out of cell range up on the 93 North in Banff. That could be super helpful. Or change their return date. You know, could be, you know, whatever message, it could be super helpful to you. If you're on a multi-day trip, you can arrange to get somebody or some device to send you avalanche and weather condition updates for your trip. So obviously, if you have that, that could be super helpful for your decision making in the field. In an emergency, here's how they work. If they all have an SOS button, you take the device out, make sure it has a clear view to the sky, and you press that SOS button. It's gonna find your position, send it to a satellite, and then it's gonna go to an emergency coordination center in the States, who will then contact usually the police of jurisdiction or the SAR group of jurisdiction. For many of the Parks Canada regions, it comes directly to us from that coordination center. And you'll get a message back that it's been successful. That obviously takes some time. So somebody had a question about companion rescue. This is not the time, if you've got somebody that can't breathe and their airway is clogged, that you're holding this device and making sure all this happens successfully. I have had incidents where people have pressed that SOS button, they've been in the middle of companion rescue, they've hucked it in their backpack, thought the message went, and it never went. When they finished digging the person out, they pulled it out and they realized that their position never was sent, wasn't successful. So definitely, in my opinion, focus on that companion rescue and then get out the device and make sure you get a good, successful send of message. So then it'll come back to us. And then what you might expect to get in return is you might get a phone number with the Emergency Coordination Center saying, text this number. That number could be your direct conduit to the incident commander, the rescue leader coming to your rescue. And what we need you to do is just to respond with, it could be simple as, and we know you're busy, could be as simple as hi, but maybe you follow up with the nature of the incident and the injuries involved. And then as soon as I have that texted to me, then I can, as I'm flying out there, I might be peppering you with a few more questions, not to deviate from your important task of patient care, but maybe that would just help us access you quicker. The one important thing, and we've had this happen a few times, those emergency phone numbers that I showed you at the bottom of the avalanche forecast, or you might see them published in books. Whatever you do, don't text those numbers. Those are landlines, and we've had people say, well, we sent you all kinds of texts, but we didn't get them. So it's okay to text the emergency coordination center, but not to our local dispatch centers, because those are landlines. If you've been given a number to text, you can text that number too. If at some point you realize I didn't get my message out, you may still have, you didn't get that confirmation, you may still have to think about sending somebody out or getting to a better location where you'll get a better view, clearer view of the sky. Whoops. Sorry. There's a couple of other things we want you to be aware of with these devices, and that's it seems to be happening less, but there have been several cases of accidental activations, and maybe with the older devices, I think it's been engineered out with the newer devices. But what was happening is people would have it in their pack, and then they'd stop for lunch, maybe sit on their pack, accidentally press the SOS. And they're sitting there for an hour, and then next thing you know, a helicopter shows up going, are you okay? And they don't know that they've pressed it. So I recommend putting it in a protective case, so you don't inadvertently, those older models where that's a possibility, to protect it. The last thing I'd just like to alert people to, sometimes we get calls that Johnny's on this multi-day trip. He's been checking in with us every day. We've been following him on the computer where he is, but he didn't check in. We don't treat that as an immediate alarm for a need for rescue. There would have to be other compounding things that might alert us to that maybe there's need for a rescue. There's lots of reasons why these devices, why somebody may fail to miss their prescribed check-in. So just so you know, that's largely how we view that kind of scenario. So in my mind, I know we don't want to totally rely on these devices. We want some self-sufficiency to reduce our vulnerability, but I tend to never go into the backcountry without having some kind of emergency communication device. You need your first aid kit, but you also need that device that's going to get the bigger first aid kit on rolling. So leads us to, is rescue coming? You've got that confirmation. Is rescue coming? And AJ's covered this so well. You definitely have to think about the bigger picture. And somebody was asking about daylight. Certainly we seem to get a lot of calls like an hour before dark, and that's stressful because we're not just sitting around next to the helicopter. We got to assemble our teams together, which can take some time. COVID, we're not working in the office after hours. We're all home and doing things that we do, and got to pull everybody together. So there's not a lot of time in the winter. So we as rescue teams, like, you can reduce our stress and maybe improve your chance of not spending the night out by starting your trips early. Leave that larger window for rescue, and you have a better chance of getting rescued that day. Not to mention a better chance of getting parking these days. It's another good point. The other thing that can delay, or we'll wait on, is weather, as AJ mentioned. Hazards. There could be avalanche hazard increasing, or other rescues that are ongoing and we're sort of triaging. Another reason why it's helpful if you can give us more information. I put up a couple of photos. This is in 2013, a Mount Balfour incident, crevasse accident, party of 3, one fellow fell in the crevasse, and they were in a storm at the Balfour High Call, for those of you familiar with the Wapta ice fields, and we couldn't get to them. We tried on foot, but the avalanche hazard was too high, or going too high, and the terrain was just, we couldn't see well enough. Tried to fly in. We sat and waited to fly in, never able to fly in the second day. It wasn't until the third day we got in, and these guys had some good survival skills. They dug in, and it wasn't a very comfortable looking cave, but it did the trick. It kept them alive up high on the mountain. A similar thing happened on a Mount Rhonda accident. These folks were very prepared. Their friend fell through the cornice and had a chest injury. They had some sort of improvised toboggan that they were able to drag them off the mountain, get to a point where they could build a snow cave. The weather was poor. We couldn't fly to them. We camped nearby the hut and walked in first thing in the morning to drag them to the helicopter. So it's good to have those tools. So I am curious here, how ready are you for handling an incident in the backcountry? I'm kind of curious as to what level of first aid you might have out there. So Brent maybe can launch that pool and people can chime in. Wow, so it's interesting. Can everybody see those results?
Yeah, they should be able to.
You can see where you, yeah, okay, cool. So you might see from that, like, well, maybe, if I'm furthering my education so that I'm ready to handle things out there, you might think about looking for first aid courses or some wilderness survival courses. And then it looks like quite a few people have even more advanced training. But things like that can really help you when things start to go sideways and preparing, caring for your patient. So say now we are coming, the rescue's coming. It's been, we were able to circumnavigate all those obstacles and we're en route. How do you prepare for our arrival? So generally, we would say it's a good idea to stay put, so we don't have to go and relook for you. Meandering around can sometimes aggravate injuries and maybe make a bad situation worse. You want to save your battery on your devices and keep them warm. But there are some occasions where you may want to move if you're in a hazardous location. This was an avalanche accident in Bow Hut. They were a little bit off route. The normal route is on this red line. It was a bit stormy, hard to see. You could see how they might get a bit disoriented and ended up coming over here. And the person at this star triggered this blue line avalanche, which in turn sympathetically triggered this larger avalanche.
Hey, Lisa.
Yeah.
I can't see your screen right now. So I think it went away from that with that poll there. Sorry.
Oh, thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem.
I have the power, I think. There we go. So can you see it?
Yeah, you got her. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that. So here, Bow Hut's up here, Wapta Icefields, Banff Park, and the red line is sort of where people normally go. Again, that whiteout condition, a person got to around here above this rock, triggered this blue line avalanche, and that sympathetically triggered this larger yellow line avalanche. And the person was right about here with my mouse is, and was avalanche down here, completely buried, just like what AJ said, broken leg. And there they were, and they had a sat phone, so that was great. We were able to talk to them. But increasing avalanche hazard, and it was end of the day, poor visibility, we weren't able to come in. And we were hopeful that they could drag the person out of this hazardous, out from underneath all this hang fire. This slopes over here hadn't slid yet. But for whatever reason, they weren't able to do that. They had a hole there already dug from where they dug out their friend. He had a broken leg. And they weathered the night there. Fortunately, there were no other avalanches. So I encourage you to, just as AJ said, think about, the aftermath. Think about what you have in your kit. Think about if you had to move them just a bit to even just get out of that hazardous terrain, or get to a spot that makes you easier to pick up. There are many, like, bothy bags, there's alpine threadworks, you can make your own toboggans, or just even a simple bivy sack can be very instrumental helping you move a patient. The other thing we recommend is, as we're coming in, you want to be visible. So if there's an open area, go stand in it. If you have brightly colored clothing, wave it at us as we're coming in. If you have a choice and you're buying new clothing, buy brightly colored clothing. That'd be awesome. If you have a headlamp or even your phone, turn on the flashlight and shine it at us as you're giving us the rescue Y as we're looking for you. It's incredible how well these lights can really just pick up your eye as you're scanning the mountainside looking for somebody. If you're not the party that needs to be rescued, then give us that rescue no and hold it. We could be looking at other things and might not see you if you just flash it to us. Give us the rescue no until we fly away and start looking for other parties. There's a lot of people in the mountains these days, so we might buzz up to you and see if you're the party. And how it generally rolls, if you're wondering with respect to rescue, what we might initially do is fly by, and what we're doing, we might hover, we're assessing the risk to you, to us, how we're gonna access, how we're gonna get out. And ideally, we're looking for the lowest risk scenario, which could be land nearby and get the patient over to the helicopter and then leave. You can help this out if you were in an area that we could land the helicopter and you maybe tromped out a helipad, maybe shoveled it flat. Maybe you were near some trees to give us some reference, but far enough that we're not worried about it with the rotor blades of the helicopter. Maybe you're on a knob of train. That could be a super nice place to land for a helicopter. We hope that you secure your loose items. So if you're wearing ball caps, you've tucked those away. Any loose articles, you've tucked that away, secured light backpacks. And stay crouched and protect your patient, because there's a lot of rotor wash when we land. And most importantly, once the helicopter lands, don't approach the helicopter. Stay put, stay huddled with your gear, protect your patient, and we'll come to you. If we leave, don't panic, because we might just be coming up with a plan. We might come in with a different setup. We might be helicopter slinging into you, which is the long line that's attached to the belly of the helicopter, and that might be the best tool for us. If we're coming in on foot, you could consider flagging a route in for us. That might be a helpful thing in certain circumstances. If we're calling to you, please call back to us. Sometimes people have thought they might trigger an avalanche by calling back to us, but that's a Hollywood thing. And we might ask you to arrange to meet us at a specific point to guide us into where your patient is. So that's generally how you can prepare for our arrival. Just got a couple more slides there here if you're looking at the time. Our responses, and wherever you are, it's a real coordinated effort. And the more information we have from you, the better we are able to tailor your rescue so that we make sure we have the right resources for you. And if we don't need certain resources, we could stand them down depending on the nature of the incident. Something that's super cool and we're very grateful for is all our mountain park teams in Parks Canada and Kananaskis. And I'm sure several of the BC SAR teams, we work with the medical director. This is a physician who works volunteer in our case, helps guide our scope of practice, our training, provides advice. And I have such a wonderful audience. I just want to share our thank you from our SAR members to these wonderful physicians, Dr. Claire in Glacier Park, Dr. Unsworth for Jasper, Parker for Waterton, McLaughlin for Banff, Yoho, Kootenay, McPhailin for Kananaskis, and Trojanowski for Pacific Rim. These fabulous doctors have worked really hard at helping us look for ways and working with teams to improve the care that we provide. We've seen the links of in the chain of care really become strengthened with their involvement. And that's really what it's all about. Rescue isn't one person hero type of thing, it's a team. We have strong relationship with RCMP, with fire, medics, stars, and this all combines to providing the best care for you when you have an incident in the mountains. And really, I'm just coming to a close here, and I feel like, you know, no presentation is complete these days without reference to COVID. And COVID has definitely had a big impact on all of us, obviously. But here's how it's had an impact in the rescue world. What you can expect is that at some level, either the dispatcher or the responder coming on scene will ask you those COVID questions that we probably all have memorized now. And we will go screening through that with you. Our response times could be a little bit longer because we are generally working from home. So we're not right next to our rescue cache. You can expect that we might be bringing in some PPE we'll be wearing PPE. That's like our mask and gloves. We'll have hand sanitizer, maybe a little bit more stuff depending. And we'll be giving you a mask and gloves to wear so that we can protect each other. If you find later that you've become sick with COVID, sure I speak for every SAR member that we would appreciate it if you let us know, because we're very small teams, and if any of us has been exposed, it's really important to let us know. And then I'd like everyone to consider this, and I think for the most part people are considering, because we've had very few rescues late, knocking on wood. But I've been alerted to, and you see it in the news, you know, the chain of care, we got to consider it. So those serious accidents, somebody's tumbled down a couloir, or somebody's been buried in the avalanche, those ones where people are going to need to go to that higher level of care, those ICUs, which we know are very busy. The sooner we know that that's the direction things are going, we let EMS know so they can prepare the receiving hospitals and they can adjust and see where the patients go. So that's super important these days and to consider. So in closing, really safety, you know, it's all our responsibility. I worked for Parks Canada for a long time. It's been a top priority of Parks Canada and for SAR teams. You know, as rescue teams, we have a checklist every time we go out the door. You need to have that checklist too for your trips, whether you're skiing, you're sledding, tobogganing, whatever your activity. So we work hard to do our part in Parks Canada and SAR members to, you know, help you have, you know, safe visit to these areas. We assess risks, in some cases manage hazards, make sure that there's safety information that's freely available to everybody. And you can do your part too by seeking out the information you need to stay safe and make informed decisions while you're enjoying these amazing places. Remember to check out and have these linked on your phone. Avalanche Canada, follow us on the Facebook pages. Check out this Adventure Smart website. That's pretty cool. It has all kinds of activities and all kinds of tips in there. And don't forget about the information centers. They're a great first place to start. So make sure you're fairly prepared for whatever activity you choose. And we hope that you have a safe, enjoyable, and very memorable trip to the mountains and you don't meet me. And that's it. That's all I have.
That's awesome. Awesome, Lisa. I'll give you a few questions. We still have quite a few people on, so they might be interested in hearing your responses. So lots of radio questions. One question from Colin. As a non-professional, the radio conversation comes up frequently. Hacking a radio to get on the park's repeaters and or ACMG channels isn't kosher as per radio legislation. What's a practical alternative to close the gap between an Inreach spot, SOS, and immediate two-way communication to SAR?
Well, I found actually the texting with the Inreach or one of those devices to actually be pretty effective, and haven't really found too much of a need for, you know, direct radio comms for the most part. Like I can usually work through with just that those devices. But I know I have lots of colleagues in the audience if there's anybody else that has tips there. But in the years I've been doing it, I haven't had. I just find it a great tool to be able to text somebody and communicate with them that way.
And that might answer a question from Jessica. Would you choose Inreach over Spot or vice versa?
I don't know. I haven't looked a lot at Spot lately. You know, this is separate from anything with Parks Canada. I know for my family personally, we just went with those Inreach minis because they're so mini and I can put them in my pocket. But so are the other ones. I think they're all have their merits. But yeah, I haven't really looked at the recent developments with respect to both devices. So, but
okay,
sorry. Yeah.
From Graham, how useful is a VHF radio And he asks about frequencies, what frequencies are required. I imagine that's different depending on where you are.
Yeah, like, well, for Parks Canada, you need to have, for the, I believe for the VHF, you'd need to have a ham license. And we don't really talk on those frequencies to our clients in the parks. So I don't know if BC, maybe AJ, if you have some different experiences with speaking to people on VHF, but I mean, if there's a professional guide, we'll talk to them on the frequencies they're licensed to use. But yeah, we don't communicate typically on a radio.
And would the non-subscription PLB devices be worthwhile or useful?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the differences are and what they're capable of doing. I imagine they would still have the same SOS, maybe just a little less texting capability. I think, yeah, I would have to compare that. I couldn't really comment because I'm not super familiar with the non-subscription mode. Maybe somebody in the group might know about the details of those kinds of tools. Yeah, I don't know.
And here's a different kind of question from Jennifer. Is Parks Canada looking at pursuing people for damages if they trigger an avalanche that results in damages? I guess there were 2 snowboarders that got charged in Colorado.
Oh, not to my knowledge. No, I don't know. Yeah, no, I'd say no.
Okay.
Not that I've been told.
Not that any of us have heard.
A bit above my pay grade. I don't know.
Okay,
just,
this is the first
on the rope. Comes gets ya.
Here's a first aid question from Dasha. As a casual recreational backcountry skier, would you recommend level 3 first aid or a 200 or 400 hour wilderness first aid training?
Yeah, I think what I would do is, I mean, there's so many first aid courses out there. I'd look at the content of what they're offering, and you know, it could be a tall order to do a huge first aid course, but like one that's 400 hours, maybe that's something you would work towards, and just make sure it's a good fit for your activities. Make sure it covers those vulnerability points that you would be able to manage. And that's what I would compare as the content within these courses, and maybe look for some references, like if you know anybody that's taken them and what they thought of them, because there are so many different courses out there. So you kind of have to do a bit of research to compare one against the other.
Great, thanks. And I'll give you one more here from Russell. Would you recommend to hit the SOS button on an Inreach and sit still without cell service, or hike out to look for cell service while your injured partner waits? From what I have heard, the SOS search function can take significantly longer for a search party to be engaged.
Yeah, there's a few layers there. I guess it would depend the region you're in. It's for sure, like, you know, there are layers depending where you are. Like, it goes from that emergency coordination center. It could go to the RCMP in Canada and then get to the SAR group. And that process could take some time in some cases. So it's not a bad idea to, depending on the condition of your patient, to go and follow it up with a phone call if you can, to help give some of that extra information. And if you think you're in a place where, you know, that there could be a delay in activating the SAR group. I know we've had some calls where we've had the PLB, and then it was followed up with a phone call. And it can be super helpful to speak directly to a person. Like maybe you don't have to even go very far to do that.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. That's great info.
Super fun. I'm psyched that so many people are so keen. Thanks so much.
Brent.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. I did have a couple people here with their hands up for questions. I don't know if they're still lingering in there. Evelyn Benson, you got your hand up. I was wondering, I have unmuted you if you want to ask a question from the floor there. And I know sometimes folks like to put their hand up because they're just playing with the buttons and they didn't realize that they did. And we also have a Tegan Hobbs out there. If you have a question, you can ask it right now if you'd like. Looks like her hand went down. How about Simone Williamson? And we're going to go for one more from John West and see if he's still hanging in there to ask his question. All right, it looks like we've gone through the majority of the folks here. Thank you very much to AJ and Lisa. Like, there's tons of great tips from those two. If you still have questions, you know, good old Uncle Google's out there. There's tons of information online on rescue toboggans, VHF radios, avalanche awareness, first aid training, you name it. There's so many resources available on our website as well, avalanche.ca, one-stop avalanche shop. The biggest thing for us is that brand new Avy Savvy online tutorial. It's fantastic. We just rebuilt the whole thing. It's free. You can do it in the luxury of your own home. You can do it with your friends. Like, get on our website, check it out. It's super awesome information. The next thing I'd like to talk about is we always appreciate you folks coming out. We're great to see all you keen people. We'd like to thank you for your interest in avalanche safety. You can support these essential services by donating to us as little as 10 bucks. You know, donate at Avalanche Canada. We're a nonprofit organization. There's a link there on the screen. We'll also put a link in the old chat box here right now. We do the webinars every week. Next week, Thursday, January 28th, we're featuring the Mount Harvey case study. Really good presentation, folks. And then there's going to be a second presentation on Plan Like a Pro. Pre-registration for those events, you guys. And thank you again for your time tonight. You know, we went a little long tonight, but I think it was pretty engaging information out there. So thanks for coming out. Hope nobody becomes a rescue statistic out there. I think we've got you educated up a little bit better than that. And I hope you folks enjoy the rest of the winter. Thanks.